Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Hannah Barnes, investigative journalist, now associate editor of the New Statesman and the author of Time to Think, the inside story of the collapse of the Tavistock's gender service for children. We spoke about the CAS review, which has just come out, the culmination of a many-year investigation into what has gone wrong with paediatric gender care. So these are children referred to the NHS for treatment for gender dysphoria. There has been a litany of errors made, various recommendations coming out of this review. Hannah took us through all of them in great detail and with great authority. We also spoke at the end of the episode about maternity services, about recent investigation that Hannah did into the treatment of birth trauma in maternity services of the NHS. This is an NHS bashing episode. There are a litany of failures, and actually often quite similar failures between these different areas of between these different services. The extended version of the episode, as always, is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the back catalogue of extended episodes, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, and also the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. All right, Hannah, should we start by talking about the CAS review? For people who have no idea what this is, what is a CAS review? Who is CAS? 101 basics.
So Dr. Hilary Cass is a very respected paediatrician, so a doctor who specialises in children, and she was the president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health for some years. She's also, interestingly, had experience of whistleblowing herself when she used to work in hospital care. And she was commissioned, she was retired by this point, but she was commissioned in 2020 by NHS England to undertake an independent review of gender identity services for children and young people. And that review was brought about by several things, actually. So one was that there was a judicial review underway, which was brought by a young woman called Kira Bell, who had transitioned. She'd had a double mastectomy, had injected testosterone for several years, having been on puberty blockers, and then regretted that transition. And she brought a court case against the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, which housed, now it's in the past, the Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS, and arguing that she actually argued that under 18s couldn't provide consent to puberty blockers. So that was going on. NHS England themselves had changed their official stance on puberty blockers, so they no longer described them as fully reversible. They said, while they are described as physically reversible, the long-term impacts on cognitive development, sexual identity, various other things are unknown, bone health. And I think the third factor was reporting in the media that had brought some of the really quite serious concerns about clinicians working at GIDS into, a broader public sphere. So I would say that was mine and Deborah's reporting at Newsnight. And we weren't the first at all, but the BBC has that power to reach a wider audience.
Newsnight is about the most prestigious news platform in the country. So, yeah, I think that would have made an enormous difference to public opinion.
Oh, well, sadly, the BBC has seen fit to destroy Newsnight, really, which is very sad.
Yeah, at the time.
At the time, yes.
Yeah.
That's who Dr. Cass is. That's how the review was begun. And she released an interim report in February, March 2022, and we've just had the final one. And really, it's an incredibly thorough, compassionate piece of medical work. So it's completely evidence-based. She has spoken to young trans-identifying children and older young people who have been through GIDS, who've had mixed experiences. She's spoken to those who have very successfully transitioned, those who have detransitioned. She spoke to lots of clinicians and has produced a 388-page report, which has done the most remarkable thing, really, in the UK, which is to bring about political consensus and consensus across the media, at least, that this is a thorough piece of work that needs to be listened to, and that we've badly let down a very vulnerable group of children.
So what would you say that consensus is at this point, that the management was poor of the paediatric cases?
Oh, well, way more than that. The management was atrocious. And I say that the management was atrocious at, the service level, at GIDS, at the Tavistock Trust level, at NHS England level. I mean, there's been an absolute abject failure of leadership on so many levels in this story, and at political and regulatory level, and within the media as well. But no, I think it's much more than that. We've allowed a really powerful drug to be rolled out without any of the normal checks and balances we would expect, and without
so this is the puberty blockers specifically,
and cross-sex hormones or gender-affirming hormones, whichever language you want to use, as well, to children, to under 18s, without knowing really if they're safe and or clinically effective, and what any of the long-term impact is. So that is quite damning. And to hear a leading doctor say, we have badly let down this group of children, they deserve better, and the evidence base is completely lacking, I think really has been a rocket up the backside to those who've ignored this story for many years.
One of the things I found really shocking about the Cass review, I mean, I probably didn't find it as shocking as...
I didn't find it shocking. I knew it all, but...
well, yeah, right. But, I mean, it was... Yes. So, I don't know. I don't know if vindicating is quite the right word, but one of the most objectively shocking things in it is the lack of research, actually, that was done. The lack of basic record keeping, and the fact that there was so much basically experimental treatment being done on these children, and knowingly, it seems to me, I mean, there just wasn't the evidence base there to suggest that, say, puberty blockers didn't have side effects. All of these claims, there just wasn't actually the evidence there to support them at all.
No, and it's quite shocking. I mean, this first came out during the judicial review, that there weren't really any decent data. But, for a clinic to run for 35 years and not have basic data on its core treatment pathway, I mean, how many were referred, what age they were, what sex they were. I mean, Dr. Cass told me she spoke to a few journalists on publication of the report, and told me that the adult clinics couldn't even provide the very first stage of the research they'd hoped to undertake, which was providing the sex and age of the people who'd gone through GIDS and onto adult services. And she said, well, if they don't have that is seriously concerning. To not even record that is quite extraordinary. But yes, I mean, sadly, there have been opportunities to both conduct proper research, to follow up, to change direction when data came back that suggested actually this intervention didn't seem to be helping many of the young people, but they never took them. It's extraordinary, and it's extraordinary that it went on for so long and that it was allowed to go on for so long.
And do you think the two possible causes that occur to me are common or garden NHS incompetence, or dogmatism? What do you think is the balance between those two possible causes?
I think it's probably both those and more. I think to start with, it was definitely, I mean, I'm always a believer in cock up over conspiracy, to be frank. In most instances, that is usually the case. I think to start with, it was providing a service to a very small number of children. It just wasn't on the radar, really. And it fell under this bit of the NHS, which is specialised commissioning, which is about, I think, about 250 different services. So it just wasn't really getting any attention. And I think it came across the radar as this referrals started to absolutely rocket. And
so GIDS was this was in existence from the early 90s.
Yeah, I mean, it opened
long before this became a really big phenomenon.
Well, it opened in 1989 at St George's Hospital, actually, in Southampton. It moved to the Tavistock in 1994, but it became under the control, if you like, the central commissioning of NHS England in 2009. So from that point, it was known as a national specialist service. So it had this very weird status anyway. It sat within the Tavistock Trust, but actually it was kind of contracted by this central NHS. So that caused all sorts of difficulties anyway. But NHS England were responsible for commissioning that to serve the whole country. And they were the ones responsible for asking for data. They were the ones who oversaw the rolling out of puberty blocking at ever younger ages without demanding to see any robust data to support that decision. And they were the ones that, frankly, allowed things to continue when it was quite clear that there were significant problems going on in the service. So I think to start with, it wasn't on the radar. So understandably, there were only 50 children or something. But as things really grew very, very quickly, it should have been. Now, is that dogmatism? I think it's really difficult to explain what's happened apart from, Dr. Cass touches on it. She talks about toxicity. I don't think she actually means what everyone has said about, generally the public shouting at each other from different perspectives. I think she means within the mental health and the medical professions in this context. And so many clinicians that worked at GIDS told me that there was just this assumption that gender was somehow special and therefore they were the experts and nobody asked any questions. One described it as a magic cloak. And I think that's what's happened in so many other bits of society as well. It's like we would, all we did at Newsnight in those first few films was ask the questions you would of any other part of the NHS. And yet it's treated in a completely different way. It's treated as being critical of the group of people being cared for rather than the treatment. Whereas we would never assume that in any other reporting. If you were reporting on a new cancer treatment and you said, well, where's the trial? Where's the data? We've actually got people here that it's harmed. You wouldn't say, oh, you hate people with cancer. So I think across the board, I think there's this fear. Gender has somehow become this thing that becomes exceptional and usual standards don't apply. So I think both dogmatism and incompetence and fear.
I know from reading your book that there were some people within GIDS who definitely encouraged that sort of magic cloak effect, but there was conflict within the service, right, in terms of some people being more ideologically committed to the trans activist agenda than others.
Yeah, I think in the early years, I have to say, I don't think anyone, and even now, no one sets out to harm children. People go into these professions because they want to help. And when puberty blockers were first rolled out to treat children with gender-related distress, it was absolutely with the best of intentions. No one questions that children can have these feelings of distress from a very young age, and that they're really distressing and impacting their lives. Like, that isn't under question. And so there appeared to be this treatment that would help them, and there weren't very many of them, and what have you. And so I don't think at the beginning it was particularly ideological. It was seen as a helpful intervention, and certainly there was pressure within the medical community to follow this pathway as well. I think as time went on and more cautious people left the service, then it became overpopulated with with more ideological viewpoints, because there was no way of explaining why you'd continue working there when all this was coming out, really, unless you truly believed that this was the only thing that could help this group of young people, and that pretty much everybody in front of you experiencing distress was trans. Whereas those who were really worried were saying, well, a distressed child, some of them will grow up to be trans adults. That's what the old studies showed us. Some always did, but many of them won't, and we're not giving them the right care.
And this was at the time as well where we had this real change in the profile of the patients that were coming before the service. So a much, much larger number of adolescent teenage girls the ROGD sample. I don't know if that's an acronym that would be
I don't
accepted
use it
within the NHS now.
But
okay.
No, I mean, and to be fair to Lisa Lippman, the researcher that sort of coined that phrase, she never intended it as a diagnosis. It was just an observation. It was a way of describing what she saw, and it's been
rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Yeah, rapid onset gender dysphoria. So it's not a diagnosis. It's not a way of labelling people. It was what she witnessed amongst certain people, and certainly
it's a phenomenon.
And certainly, I think gender clinicians across the Western world who work at children's gender clinics will say, and the data bear this out, that there's been a shift towards adolescent females whose distress started at or after puberty. So, they tend not to use rapid onset gender dysphoria, but it's describing the same phenomena, I suppose. So what happened was, traditionally, there were always girls, but it was traditionally that the caseload was heavily skewed towards boys whose distress had started in childhood, and that persisted all the way through their childhood and then into puberty, and then it got worse. And then it moved to predominantly girls who had a gender uncontentious childhood, if you like, and the distress around their bodies and their gender identity began during puberty. And not only that, but it often went alongside really some quite other serious difficulties that we're contending with, like eating disorders, anxiety, depression, and sometimes traumatic backgrounds of abuse or loss or bereavement, things like that. So it wasn't that these clinicians were saying no one who's suffered depression can be trans. They weren't saying that at all, but they were just saying, given there's so much going on for these young people, we don't feel that what we're offering them is safe, because we're not exploring what else might be going on that might explain how they're feeling other than you're trans.
Also a lot of autism, right?
Yep.
In these girls. So this has been remarked upon as quite a
and the boys massively overrepresented than you'd see in the general population of children. I mean, we'd expect, I think it's about 2% in general population terms, whereas GIDS's own data estimated that about 35% of referrals exhibited moderate to severe autistic traits. Now, that's not quite the same as a diagnosis, but it's still pretty high.
I presume these are young people who are skewing towards the high functioning end.
Not always.
Okay.
Not always. I mean, in fact, it was, I think, one of the things that I have found so upsetting about doing this work and particularly writing the book is how vulnerable some of these children are. It's really difficult to convey. A small number, but a number. We're talking, they cannot read and write, they're non-verbal, they're facing sexual abuse in the family setting, they're in care, they're having sex with adults while in care when they're 14, 15. It's, we're not talking about your middle class, bit stressed kid. Some of them were, but it's really important that people understand how vulnerable and traumatized some of these children were.
Yeah, I think that's worth emphasising, because there is a tendency, and it's not wrong, but the stereotype of the maybe slightly autistic girl at a private school who cottons on to being identifying as non-binary or trans or whatever, that exists absolutely as a phenomenon. And I know anecdotally, I know so many examples of that. But that isn't the only thing we're talking about, right? With kids, we're also talking about very vulnerable children who I presume are ending up there through their social workers. I mean, how are they ending up
Sometimes,
referred?
often through CAMS, actually. I mean,
Okay.
one of the young adults now I spoke to for
Child
the
and
book.
adolescent mental health services, right?
Yeah. Pick me up. Child and adolescent mental health services. I mean, that's where the majority of referrals came from. I mean, one of the people I speak to for the book, Jack, he's a trans man, but he was in a children's home, and when he was first sent to GIDS, and transitioned from female to male, and had been sectioned before he went to GIDS, had really very traumatic childhood, was in foster care, and then and actually with him, he wasn't referred for any medical interventions while he was at GIDS because they saw how vulnerable he was.
So there were instances of clinicians
of course.
getting it right.
I mean, nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really not the case that everybody received poor care or everybody was rushed onto blockers. It's not the case. And I think, were that the case, then it kind of never would have happened because, and I think one of the features of the story is that the care that a young person and their family received was entirely dependent on who they were assigned to in terms of clinicians. So at one end of the scale, you could get a really affirmative clinician who might refer you to endocrinologists to be prescribed puberty blockers after an hour or two in a small number of cases. Or you could get someone who was very cautious, who did a lot of exploration. And in fact, you might still be referred to endocrinology, but after 30 appointments, which would span 3 years. So it's a very different experience, depending on who you got, which is one of the things that Dr. Cass is trying to get rid of, like moving forward.
You talked about there being this sort of attrition over time, where the more responsible clinicians left. Did they leave because of pressure from colleagues, or did they leave just because they lost confidence in the service, or what was why was that attrition happening?
They left for a variety of reasons. Many left because they couldn't do the work anymore. They didn't think it was safe. They felt it was unethical, and they couldn't do it anymore. They wouldn't work in a service that they felt they were harming children, quite frankly. Some left because it is incredibly difficult to work in this field. It's toxic, and by the time we get to 2019-20, there is much more focus from the media. So I don't doubt that did have an impact as well. It's not an easy place to work, and some, things happen in their lives. People leave, they get married, they move abroad, they have children. So some was just natural attrition, but for sure, a sizable number of people left because they felt it wasn't safe and it wasn't ethical, and they blew the whistle, and they tried to raise concerns for years internally, and nothing changed. And they said, how I can't be part of this anymore.
Were those whistleblowers ignored because of the ideological factors, because of the magic cloak?
I think partly, but I think it's much more complicated than that. I think part of it, something that pretty much everybody raised with me, even those actually who spoke about the work of GIDS quite favourably, talked about money. I mean, GIDS, that contract that we talked about, because it was guaranteed income from the central NHS, and the Tavistock and Portman Trust is very, very small. It's a mental health trust. It's always kind of struggled financially. And here you had this guaranteed source of income that was growing really quite rapidly. And the fact is now that GIDS is closed, the last financial year, GIDS alone was, I think, 14% of the income brought into the trust. And when you add that onto the adult gender clinic they have, it's a quarter. So that's gone. And now, moving forward, the Tavistock and Portman can't survive as an independent trust. So it was very important. But it wasn't as kind of calculated as we can't act on these concerns because we'll lose the money. But most people feel it was in the back of management's mind. So with that, I think there's an element. One of the clinicians I've spoken to for very many hours, Dr. Anna Hutchinson, I think she's probably spot on when she says it's kind of human nature, because for the service to confront the difficulties and what these staff were saying, it meant coming to terms with the fact that they might have harmed children in the past. And that's really hard to do, and painful. But, doctors have to do that all the time. And that's part of medicine. And I think the longer it went on for some staff, the director of the service and the leadership had all been there well over a decade. How'd you say that to yourself? And as human beings, we don't like admitting we're wrong. So I think that was part of it. So I don't think ideology was even the most important thing. It was part of it. I think pressure and sort of almost a fear of some of the trans support groups stopped them changing direction when they should have, because they didn't want the backlash, rather than an absolute belief in what they were doing, which I think is potentially even worse. But
yeah, in a way, what's almost more disturbing about it is it wasn't. I mean, ideology, as you say, is a factor, but a lot of it was probably just normal failure, which happens within institutions.
Oh yeah, totally. And it was a bedding down. And we see it in every NHS scandal there is. We see it, don't we? Whistleblowers raise concerns. Management don't want to touch it. It escalates a bit, and then it's about reputational damage. We see it in every single health scandal that there is.
And in most institutions, I think of something like, I don't know, Catholic sex abuse or something, completely different kind of institution, but institutions have a tendency to want to protect themselves. Yeah. And people want to cover their asses, and they don't want to admit that they're wrong and that they've done harm.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, those in the trust, but outside of GIDS, it's really quite whom I spoke to quite a few people, and there was this really interesting dynamic going on where they knew there was a problem, and some of them did speak up and try to help, but at the same time, they kind of knew that if it all came out, it would destroy the trust, and they didn't want to do that.
And this is during a period where it was becoming much more salient as a media issue. So, I mean, they might be scared of the trans activists, but there are lots of people to be scared of in this kind of.
Yeah, no, I don't think it was that. Not for many people. Not for those outside of the service. I think it was, it became very apparent researching the book that this thing, the TAVI, as it was affectionately known as, like, people loved it. And they didn't want to destroy it because actually it had done a great amount of good for many people in the past. And it had kind of, the gender services were so at odds with what the rest of the trust did and was famous for. And there was the kind of resentment there as well. So if we could only sort them out, then we can save the trust.
Do you think that there was the lack of proper data recording that Cass identifies, do you think that was partly motivated by that fear of scrutiny? Was there a knowledge that actually the data might not be very favourable for the service?
Possibly. I mean, I think it's very, very odd how there was essentially one treatment pathway. That's not to say that everybody was referred for blockers, but that was basically the only treatment. To not make it easy to identify those who have gone down that pathway is just strange. And they didn't do that until the judicial review. There was no separate field. So for years, people asked freedom of information requests. How many children have you referred for endocrinology? We don't know. It's in the patient notes. I think some of it was just really poor clinical practice and inability to do research properly. But I think, the fact is they did get data back, which showed, the first hint of it was 2015, but certainly by 2016, they had undertaken a research study, by which point everybody who was participating in that had been on puberty blockers for at least a year. So they had this data, which showed it wasn't beneficial. And yet they ploughed on. So
In terms of reducing distress,
Yeah,
you mean
in
it
terms
wasn't
of
beneficial?
in terms of anything, in reducing gender dysphoria, which they had predicted that it would, in terms of reducing, improving mental health, everything. So I think some of it was definitely not reporting it because, I suspect there might have been questions, but I think some of it was just they weren't very good. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, really, in the last year or so, we've had these open letters from, until very recently, current GID staff talking about how fantastic they are at research. I mean, there's such an enormous, incredible level of cognitive dissonance going on that I don't think they knew how bad they were at some of the absolute basics.
Were they also very overstretched? Because one of the things that a lot of trans activists used to say at the time when the Tavistock was still operating GIDS was that it can't possibly be the case that we're seeing children fast tracked into puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones because the waiting lists are so long that couldn't possibly be the case. And in fact, that the waiting list being so long is evidence of the fact that this care is not being provided to these children and stuff. And I always thought at the time, like, are the waiting list not really long because there's been this massive explosion of social contagion? And so you'd expect a massive increase in demand for a service that isn't very elastic because it's the NHS, right? But I imagine that from the inside of the service, those very long waiting lists probably did lead to clinicians being really overstretched and maybe cutting corners and not having the time.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, there's lots of to unpick there. I mean, they definitely were amazingly overstretched. And, not everything in this sad story is GIDS's fault or the Tavistock's fault at all. I mean, it's been apparent for like years that extra resource was needed. I mean, they haven't met the 18-week target of waiting time target since 2015. So, I mean, this has been a problem for a long, long time. They were amazingly stretched. I mean, there were caseloads, individual caseloads of 140s, the most I've heard of. I mean, so much so that families and children would turn up and clinicians felt absolutely appalling because they couldn't remember who they were. And to start with, the suggestion of NHS England was, we'll give you more money, get some more staff in, get some junior staff in. And the idea was that those junior staff would learn from the more experienced ones, but the more experienced ones had no capacity so it didn't really work. And you needed people with experience to work with this complex patient group. I mean, I don't say that to pathologise, but group service users, which whatever we want to use. But in terms of you can't rush people through because they've been on a waiting list for years. Well, I've spoken to both young people and clinicians at the service who sort of really push back quite hard on that argument, because while you're on the waiting list, you're not getting any help at all for anything that might be going on in your life. So your distress and your identity, I guess, becomes entrenched because you seek that help, probably online, and no one even gently questions what you're feeling. So by the time, and this was a problem, by the time they got to GIDS, they were so clear about what they wanted and insisted upon it that it was very, very difficult to do that sort of more therapeutic work, if you like. So there was that. The waiting list also put pressure on the clinicians to process quickly because they knew that there were just so many people wanting to see them. So just get them through. Just get them through. I mean, that is a story that is relayed so frequently in the book. And one clinician, Natasha Prescott, said that she found herself at one point just thinking, identifying with the nurses at mid-staffs, the crisis at Mid-Staffordshire Hospital. And she said, at what point do you spread your resources so thinly that we're doing everything we can to provide a service, but the service itself is now unsafe? Like, what's the goal here?
Because giving puberty blockers is easy, right? It's just you write a prescription and it's kind of low time intensity for the clinicians to choose that path.
I mean, this sounds awful, but when a young person, so GIDS never prescribed, they refer on to the endocrinologist, which is also a very strange setup, but endocrinologists at either Leeds General Infirmary or University College London hospitals would do the prescribing. But what happened in terms of GIDS then was that person would be seen less frequently. So it would free up some time in that clinician's schedule to see someone new.
Because they were changing team.
Well, they weren't changing team, they were just seen less often. So in the assessment phase, you might be seen every 4 to 6 weeks. When your assessment is complete and it may end up in this referral to endocrinology, you're then seen every 3 to 4 months. So logistically,
there's a malign
sense.
incentive there.
Yeah.
Did the endocrinologist ever say no to referring puberty blockers?
No, it appears almost never did the endocrinologist say no. I mean, we had some data back in 2022, and of 1,089 children under 18s who were referred to endocrinology, one had been deemed unable to provide consent. And actually, that young person was 16. A couple of them were ruled out for being unwell, but generally the mantra that I heard from clinicians at GIDS was that the endocrinologist would say, well, we trust your judgment. So this idea that there was a dual process where there was two kinds of assessment, there really wasn't. There was an assessment of perceived suitability and readiness for the blocker, which was carried out by GIDS. And that was never questioned by UCLH. What UCLH and Leeds did was a physical test. They did a blood test and they checked things like that, but they almost never said no.
Were there concerns from the endocrinology side about some of the physical side effects? Because we know the drug that they were using was it Lupron?
They're using triptorelin here, but it's the same drug.
So this historically has been used for precocious puberty. And so I guess there's some research available.
Oh, there's lots of research when it's used in precocious puberty. It's very safe. We understand completely how it works. There's long-term follow-up, but
But these are children with a particular
treatment.
Medical condition.
Well, it's used completely differently. So when they're used in precocious puberty, so when a child starts puberty really early, so under 8 for girls, under 9 for boys, the child takes the drug. The puberty is paused because they're too young to be going through all of that. And as soon as possible, so after a short period of time as deemed acceptable by the doctors, they come off it. They stop, and then their body goes through puberty at a more, regular age. When they're used
obviously
here,
a puberty of their own sex.
Yeah,
obviously.
the puberty of their own sex, and at that right stage of development. What happens here is that the blocker is used to arrest puberty at the standard age much later in adolescence, when this extraordinarily important time of development is going on in terms of your cognitive development, your sexual identity development, your bone development. And these young people almost never come off. They stay on the puberty blocker and then they go straight on to synthetic hormones. And so they never go through the puberty of their biological sex. And so this is what Hilary Cass is saying. And this argument is often employed by some in the trans community and their supporters, that this is somehow discriminatory, that the only children the drugs are being banned for are trans children. But that's not how medicine works. I mean, Hilary Cass has said this was a huge leap beyond what we would usually do in medicine. Like we prescribe off-label all the time to children because we don't tend to test drugs on children. But usually it's just we'll give a smaller dose than to adults. We don't just allow a completely different usage to treat a different condition, and that they function in a very different way, and for which, frankly, those working in gender care have completely failed this population by not conducting proper research.
What age would the kids then be allowed to have the cross-sex hormones? At 18?
No. So it was a bit of a fudge. It was around their 16th birthday, which GIDS clinicians would interpret as 15 and 9 months, not younger. And usually, well, the service specification, kind of the guidance document that underpinned GIDS, said that someone, in order to go on at that age, at that young, you had to be on puberty blockers beforehand. I'm not sure that always happened, but that is what the guidance said.
What was the reasoning for 16? Was that the figure chosen for?
Well, at 16, most young people are deemed capable of providing consent. It's a kind of
So they can consent to sex, they can consent to join the military, all this kind of stuff.
There was also a safety argument that across the world there wasn't really any data on their use in younger children. But again, Hilary Cass has said, while they're not banned in the same way puberty blockers are, she advises extreme caution in the prescribing of hormones to under 18s. And certainly the systematic evidence review that was undertaken both by the research team attached to the review, but also the earlier one by NICE, the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, they both reached the same conclusion that, again, the evidence base is weak for using hormones in under 18s for this purpose.
So let's talk about the recommendations. So what has Cass recommended to us? I've seen people talking about 25.
No.
I've seen some critics of hers talking about her setting 25 as an age limit. Where have they got that from?
So what she said is that at the moment, and there seems to be an acceptance of this, though, so she's advocating for more holistic services. So what she means by that is that, unfortunately, what tended to happen in the past, and again, not always GIDS's fault, certainly child and adolescent mental health services bear quite a lot of responsibility here. But again, because they're stretched, right? Let's not blame people. But what tended to happen was you'd have this very complicated, distressed young person who absolutely was experiencing gender difficulties, but also lots of other things. But once they appeared at CAMS, and they said this magic word gender, which we talk about, they would go, oh, not our problem. They can go to this really swishy national centre, which is awash with cash, which wasn't really true. And so they got palmed off. And then when they got to GIDS, it was assumed that these other problems they were experiencing were being dealt with, but they weren't. So no one did. And Dr. Cass has called this diagnostic overshadowing, where everything is seen through this one prism, and that young person doesn't get the care that they deserve and that any other young person would get if they didn't have any gender difficulties. So she's saying we need to stop that, and we need to have holistic care that looks at each young person as themselves and in the round. And the first line of help should be therapeutic, really. And what she's calling for is a sort of decentralisation. So ultimately about 8 regional centres across England. So we've got one that's open in London now, one in the northwest in Liverpool. It's going to be one in Bristol later this year, and then 4 or 5 more as time goes on. But then those will only be for very specialist cases, and the expectation is that you train up a raft of staff below that in CAMS, in other settings, because she's making the point that you have those skills anyway of working with young people. We don't need, but I mean, that's going to take years. Where the 25 thing comes in is, she said, at the moment, there's this sort of cliff edge between children's services and adult services. So you can be referred to adult services now, adult gender clinics at 17, but the model is completely different. So it's little, if any, therapeutic input, very medically focused. So it's not uncommon to get a hormone prescription at your first or second appointment.
For a cross-sex hormone?
For cross-sex hormones, yeah. Albeit you probably would have been waiting a very long time. Mm-hmm. But it's a very medical, non-assessment model, if you like. And she's just made the point that actually in many children and adolescent services, they do go up to 25 because the brain is still developing then. And she's saying that this young adult population, if you like, deserve more holistic care. But what she has absolutely not said, and I'm not really quite sure how it's been interpreted this way, she hasn't advocated taking medications away from that group. She's made no comment on it whatsoever. She's only said extreme caution up to 18 for hormones. So there's been no comment at all. And that's it, really, that we don't have this cliff edge, that we have a sort of a transition service, if you like, between adults and children's. Because apart from anything else, it's slightly intellectually coherent that you could be 17 needing all this extra support and then suddenly, no, you don't need any of it. It's more of a progression.
So what does that mean in terms of if you're a young person who's presenting with gender dysphoria, how is your experience of the NHS services going to differ now than it did, say, 5-10 years ago?
I think in the immediate term, it's pretty much the same as you're not going to get anything. You're going to be sitting on a waiting list, unfortunately. I think moving forward, the idea and the hope is that you get the care that's best for you. And for some, that will be a medical transition. But
including puberty blockers? Is that,
it may
what's the
well be.
status of them now?
So the status is they will not be prescribed by the new services. They will only be prescribed under research conditions if and when a research trial gets the ethical clearance. Now that is all in motion, but it may be quite a long time. And in fact, I speak to people who work in medical ethics, who are clinicians, who are doctors, who say they're not convinced it will ever receive approval. But, I don't know. But that is the plan. So if and when that trial gets underway, that will be the only way that under 16s can get puberty blockers.
So they are much harder to get hold of.
Well, you can't get them on the NHS anymore, unless you're already on them. So they haven't taken them away from anybody who's on them.
Okay, and so those patients will presumably continue on the same sort of pathway, because we know, unfortunately, that puberty blockers almost always progress to further medical intervention down the line. It's rare. It's rare for kids to desist once they're on the puberty blockers.
Yeah.
And then, so is the idea that there will be no medical interventions in terms of for the young patients up until they reach the adult threshold?
No, at the moment. I mean, this may well change, but at the moment, you can get hormones at 16 even in the new services. But the difference is that in order to try to avoid this situation where we've had in the past, where it was totally dependent on which member of staff you saw, any decision anywhere in the country has to be signed off by one panel of experts who have not treated that individual, and they will review everything that has gone up to that point and have to sign off the decision. But at the moment, no one is being seen by those new services who wasn't already under the care of GIDS before it closed. So as I say, it's pretty dire for young people. I mean, even going up to 25, really, the queues, the long waiting lists for adult services are, we're talking years. So it's a pretty poor state of affairs. NHS England are trying to do a bit of triaging of the young person's waiting list now and get CAMs involved, seeing people. But it's going to take time.
And this is because psychiatric care for young people full stop is bad, right? So it's that CAMs waiting lists are also really long.
It is that, but it is also the case, and I don't think we should let people off the hook, really, that it has been allowed to get so bad for so long that it's become very, very hard to fix. There really shouldn't be a situation where there are thousands of distressed children on a waiting list without any support whatsoever for years. I mean, it shouldn't have been the case that the professionals that were meant to be helping them and other professionals that should have been providing the oversight to keep them safe have allowed them to believe that the only thing that could take away their distress is now off the table, and that's sadly what's happened.
So I imagine this has been received. Well, I've seen to some extent. I've seen some of the media responses and social media responses to this. That this has been received as sort of a blow to the trans community, in the sense of having support withdrawn. I mean, I think that we both agree that not using the puberty blockers are not support, are not effective to do more harm than good.
They might be, we just don't know. And so medicine doesn't work like that. You have to first do no harm. So if there's no evidence of safe and clinically effective treatment, you have to do a proper study, which is what Hilary Cass has said. But yes, she said, we cannot continue like this because it's not right. There's no evidence. We badly let them down. So let's try and get that evidence. Now, whether that will get off the ground or not. But yeah, the trans community, well, some in the trans community feel very badly let down, and they feel this is an attack on all trans healthcare, that it will be taken away. And I do understand that. They have been treated in the past very, very badly. But actually, it is an attempt to make it better, because they have been subjected to a lower standard of healthcare and evidence and safety than anyone should expect. So I do understand why they might think that, but I think Hilary Cass is doing her very best to improve care for this group. And actually, there are trans adults who agree that things have gone badly wrong when it comes to young people. That while it will be a successful life for and it has been for them and for others, it's not easy, and it's not something to be rushed.
My understanding as well is that the evidence for any of these medical interventions significantly or even slightly alleviating suicidal ideation, gender dysphoria, like actually the idea that not just puberty blockers but cross-sex hormones, double mastectomies and so on do actually resolve the distress. That evidence also isn't there.
No, it's not. There's not really evidence there for anything. I mean, the studies that look at hormones do tend to show a short-term lift in mental health, but in terms of suicidality, there's no persuasive evidence that either puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones reduce that. And really, we just don't have decent long-term data on any of these interventions, whether it's surgical or hormonal, and certainly not on the cohort of young people that we're talking about, that sort of for the last decade or so. We just don't have it, and there's been no attempt to get it either. And when the Cass review team tried to get it, shamefully, the adult clinics refused to cooperate, despite the fact that their study had been through a very lengthy ethics process and had been approved. And they've now been forced to do that by NHS England. They've been forced to cooperate, but we'll see. That will take years. And it's difficult to know who's actually going to do that research now, because the review is over.
Do we know why the adult clinics refused to cooperate? I can guess why.
Well,
but do we know for sure?
Yeah, I mean, some of the reasons they gave were that they felt it was unethical. But as I say, that was a strange argument, given that it'd been considered for over a year in the Research Ethics Committee stage. Some said it was too labour-intensive and too resource-intensive. But again, Dr. Cass told me that didn't really make much sense either, because NHS England had promised to provide any necessary resources. Some said they didn't want to participate in research that no doubt would be used by actors who, were going to act in bad faith when the report came out. And it's baffling, really, that a group of professionals who purport to care for and help a group of people wouldn't participate in research that would be able to help them make more informed and better informed decisions going forward, because we would know how well or how badly people had fared on different pathways. It's really quite shameful.
I mean, in a way, you mentioned that trans communities' fears post-Cass review, that this indicates that all trans healthcare, I mean, that's the wrong expression, trans healthcare. I mean, people are entitled to healthcare regardless of their identity, like gender transition medical interventions would be withdrawn. And actually, I don't think that is a fanciful fear based on the evidence that actually exists to support any of this. And given that the nature of the NHS is that it is, resources are constrained. I mean, it's one of the good things actually about, I'm sure we'll get on to more NHS bashing in a second when we get on to talk about maternity, but actually it seems to me that this whole area of medicine has actually gone less disastrously wrong here, despite all of the various disasters, than it has in, for instance, America, where private healthcare allows much greater scope for
Yes,
runaway errors.
yeah, I think you're right. I think part of the fear is that the NHS England has now brought forward, as a matter of urgency, its review of adult services. I mean, I don't see taking medical transition away, but I don't see it. But talking about the States, the data is poor here, but it's non-existent over there. I mean, I've spoken to people in the States, and they say, "Oh, it's so amazing! You managed to get all this data. That's how you've managed to tell the JID story." And I said, "Well, through freedom of information, what have you." So we can get a bit because we have a centralised healthcare system, and I think we've benefited from that because we can have things like the Cass review. But you're right. In the States, we've got young girls getting double mastectomies at 12 in some cases. I mean, that's rare, but it's possible. You've got certainly going on to hormones at that age, and seemingly little to no accountability. And while I would say it is toxic here, I mean, it doesn't touch the toxicity of this in the US. And I think one of the things that was so great about the responses from the politicians on this is, bar a couple, but there does seem to be grown up political consensus now that we need to care better for this group of young people. Whereas, I mean, they're so far away from that in the US. I mean, I talk to what you might call disillusioned Democrats who are so worried, but because it's so caked in politics and all the other arguments going on about reproductive rights, abortion, what have you, it's just like I can't agree with this person because I fundamentally disagree with them on every other aspect of life. And it's become so political and a vote winner, whereas I think we have largely avoided that here, thankfully.
Yeah, it's much less partisan here. You have supporters and opponents of trans activism across the political spectrum. Yeah. Okay, from one medical scandal to another. The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.